Okay. My name is Alex Mills, and to begin at the beginning, I was born in 1914 in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada. Like a lot of individuals, my interest in chemistry was sparked by a teacher in high school, kind of a wild Welshman whose name is Mr. Evans. And he let me fill the nitric acid bottles or some exciting thing like that. But anyway, that sparked my interest, so that by the time that I went to the University of Saskatchewan, I decided that chemistry was for me. I liked the experimental part of it, and throughout my career, I've been fortunate enough to be involved with some extremely interesting people, very interesting people. Not excluding, by the way, the president of the University of Saskatchewan, Mr. Burry, President Burry, and I recall very clearly when I had to go to him and tell him I couldn't pay my tuition, could he carry me on his books for a year? He graciously said so, and I want to emphasize I did repay it, so that worked out. And so I graduated then with a bachelor's degree, Bachelor of Science, in 1934. We had in the chemistry department, as head of it, a man named Thorvaldsen, Professor Thorvaldsen, and it's a little interesting that in Saskatoon, I think there were 2 chemists employed, and they were really what they were doing was analyzing the nitrogen content by Keldol of wheat. And so why we had all the chemists who graduated and went out throughout the world, I don't know, but apparently it was due to these individuals, incidentally by a young professor named Spinks, who ultimately became president of the University of Saskatchewan. I might mention also he had a young student who was a classmate of mine, whose name is Henry Taube, who was recently awarded a Nobel Prize. So that was a landmark that ultimately came to be. And at this time, as a matter of fact, I seem to be involved with several Nobel Prize winners, because one summer, another chap and I, Stanley Herbert, worked for a new professor named Gerhard Hertzberg, who also ultimately got the Nobel Prize. And along the range of interesting things, you know, what we were doing was looking at active nitrogen and the spectroscopy of that, which occurs in the northern lights. So that one of the things that's always interesting is the diversity of things which turn up to be of interest as you think back on them. After getting a master's degree working on active hydrogen at the University of Saskatchewan, I went to Columbia University, New York City. Of course, New York City was quite a little change for me from the prairies of Saskatchewan, and I ultimately there worked with Harold Urey, doing isotopic tracers and really some quite interesting work on separation of isotopes. And as I think back of it, I actually made my first catalyst there, one which converted carbon dioxide and deuterium to CD4. CD4, heavy methane, had the advantage that nothing else was of the same molecular weight, so that in fact you could look at the mass spectrometry and tell whether you'd done separation and got some C13, more C13 in the species of separation. This was a part of a separation product. And by the way, as everybody else notices, their careers somewhat affected. It was Depression times in Saskatchewan, and of course in 1939-40, when I graduated from Columbia University, it was wartime, so there was a lot of pressure then on these social situations. I did teach a year at Dartmouth, and got married in 1940 to Roberta Walker, which ultimately turned out to have 4 children and now 9.5 grandchildren. So that also was a successful experiment. In 1940, I joined the Houdry Process Corporation, slightly different name then, CDC, Catalytic Development Corporation. And again, I was fortunate to find some very challenging and interesting people, not the least of whom, of course, was Eugene Houdry. And I was part of a small team for a while on synthetic rubber. And my goodness, we worked night and day. We worked Saturdays, we worked Sundays, we worked 11 till 11 o'clock at night on that. One of the successful things, by the way, turned out to be the butadiene process, which was Mr. Houdry's baby for a long time. And of course, the Japanese had taken the Malay Peninsula, so this was a critical feature to have ways of making synthetic rubber, and the butadiene therefore. Alex Oblad mentioned that it's unusual that Houdry, who was an engineer and not a chemist, was so successful in catalysis. And it's really a puzzle to recognize what it is that he was so successful in. But no doubt it was his inventiveness, his curiosity, and but in some perhaps unusual ways. For example, one of the things that he was insistent on was that that we regenerate nickel catalysts, and the reason was Houdry said when he had the dull tool, a nickel tool, a metal tool, they took it to the shop and sharpened it, and we ought to be able to do the same thing with a catalyst. We said, well, there's no relation. Oh, yes, there is. And he kept his work on it, and by Jove, we then found a solution. So he had the right basic concept, even though it was not a chemical concept. But he was a extremely persuasive person, enthusiastic person, and simply just believed that the catalyst could do everything. And his life was spent proving that. And towards the end of his life, he got interested in biological catalysts. He got interested in environmental control. As you know, was a key person really in automobile converters to cut down activity on that site. One also personal anecdote I told about him was that one time he had a little cold, and his secretary came in to give him a pill, and he took two. And she said, "Oh, you're only supposed to take one." And he says, "I always take double." And that was, I think, the feature of his life. Well, we had started up the first synthetic cracking catalyst plant. France was falling, 1940, and went on from that with the butadiene plant, catalysis, chromium-alumina that I mentioned. And then on the scene came Alex Oblad and Chalmers Kirkbride. And this was an era of really more the entrance of science into catalysis. And I know we got into some hot controversies about catalysts which were only activated by the approach of reactant molecules. So here was a concept that the surface of the catalyst was changed by the approaching reactant molecules, and that these dynamic situations created the active catalyst, which we were saying and still insist is not the Bronsted acid, but reacts with the alumina and the silica, and of course we contributed to the straightening out what happens with these acid catalysts. That in fact, silica alumina, which was just unbelievable in those days, could in fact be a strong acid, and you could have carbonium ion reactions.
When did you first associate carbonium ions with these silica alumina catalysts? Or do you recall how that came about?
We had a suspicion that because of troubles that we were having troubles with hydrocarbon feeds that had nitrogen compounds. And when that happened, those catalysts lost a lot of activity. And so we got the idea, and I was actually ran some of the experiments of pre-poisoning the catalyst with quinoline. And so it would turn out that if you would pass a small amount of quinoline over the catalyst, that this would deactivate them completely. And this led us to search then for what was the structure of these catalysts? And we found some references to Pauling, in which he had talked about substitution of alumina and other trivalent ions, and that this should generate acidity of high acidity, that was a big surprise that it was not only an acid. At that time, Frank Whitmore was developing his carbonium ion, now called carbenium ion, but the carbonium ion theory, and we started to look at these products. And as you recall, one of the most interesting things is the isoparaffins formed are there in more than thermodynamic equilibrium relative to the normal butane. So this is one of the characteristics of catalysts, that they can, by accelerating the hydrogen transfer reactions and isomerization to tertiary carbonium ions and the hydrogen transfer, you can form isobutane, isopentane beyond thermodynamic equilibrium. Very interesting.
Well, now, as you and Oblat were talking about the reactant activating the catalyst, were you thinking along the lines of Wolkenstein, or was this a different viewpoint that you held?
Well, a lot of similarity. And of course, it drew on the fact that aluminum chloride needed a quote co-catalyst, and the co-catalyst was HCl or HBr, and that you had to get then the base, which now is an olefin, and the co-catalyst and the catalyst all acting together to form this. And Oblad went on and called this the flip-flop theory, and it generated a lot of heat, I can tell you, right? And by the way, I have a little anecdote on that. When it first came up, Oblad gave a paper at the Faraday Society in England, and Otto Bake was there, who, as we know, was a great character in his own right. And Otto and Alex Oblad thought that the meeting was a little dull, and so Bake proposed to Oblad. He said, "You attack me in my theories, and I'll attack you, and we'll liven this place up." And so that happened, and I think actually to the betterment, and got people thinking and quite surprised. And no doubt the English were a little taken aback at this controversy, lively controversy, and maybe today we miss some of the personalities that were involved who would argue and get quite enthusiastic, and maybe damn the other people occasionally too.
Well, was that what made Bake unique, or you mentioned he was a character?
Well, he was a character in many ways, and he had a very unusual way of looking at it. I have a little story about he and Heinz Heinemann. Heinz was a young man, Bake was a very established person, and Bake had a paper that he gave, and Heinz Heinemann had the duty of asking some questions, and Heinz was so concerned that he went and took all he could think of, asked everybody else, and then at the end of Bake's paper, he went through this long list, and Bake said, "Well, I don't know about the answers, but about the questions, I don't know, I remember them all, but I know there were 13 of them." So that was but Bake had great leadership, and you remember he had on his staff Wilson and Auburn Wheeler and other people like that really were making catalytic history at a time when the science of catalysis was certainly just barely emerging. And Bake was leading his company, the Shell company, of course, into research that really was trying to get some sense out of catalysis.
Do you remember when Houdry first came in contact with the idea of catalysis in your discussions with him?
Yes. And this was in France, as we recall. Houdry was in those days trying to make synthetic fuels from lignite in France, because France did not have an adequate hydrocarbon petroleum supply. And the problem was that the gasoline they made was pretty poor stuff. And the other problem was Houdry was a race car driver, and so this low octane material didn't set well for him. But he got a hold of a little bit of gasoline at one time that was made synthetic, and he put it in his Bugatti racing car, and he found out that he could advance the spark, which was the same as saying that you could get a little higher compression ratio, or you could get a little better thing. And so he had a dual reason for doing this, and one was to get the synthetic lignite to gasoline going better, but the other was personal one, namely to get a fuel that would drive his Bugatti a little faster. And after a period of time when that particular project in France was only was kind of winding down, he was invited by Sheets and some others at what was then Saucony Vacuum to come over, and by this time he'd been interested in the catalysis and carried on from there, then in the United States, as you remember, with the support of the Saucony Mobile on the one hand, and later with the Sun Oil Company, which eventuated in the first plant operating in 1936, 1938.
How did you come to go to Houdry to go to work?
Well, John Bates was research director then, and he called up Harold Urey and said, "Do they have somebody that might be interested in the job?" And Urey recommended me, and I had known something about this company, and it sounded like they were doing some very unusual pioneering work, and I wanted to be part of it. So I little did I know what I was getting into, perhaps with Houdry, but that was how I got involved there. As usual, I looked for a job for some time, not without success, and then I got two job offers. One was with DuPont at Buffalo, and one was at Houdry in Philadelphia. Anyway, I chose the other. Never sorry I did. I thought that gave a lot of interest to my life to be participating with a group of people, because then what happened is that we had some other individuals I mentioned, Burt Farkas on the one hand, Ted Cornelius, Harry Milliken, Saul Weller, and Jerry Hinden, and others that really contributed greatly to the whole catalytic development in the 40s, 50s, 60s. And the diversity of things that was done was just great. We got involved with an unusual compound which is called Dabco, which we had the idea that we could make some heterocyclic nitrogen compounds over these same cracking catalysts and so on. So we began passing various amines and diamines and so on, and then we found a product called piperazine, and piperazine had a market because it took the worms out of chickens. And but along the line, L. Herrick, one of the chemists, said there's something funny that keeps crystallizing out, and he persisted until he fished it out and got the molecular structure with our mass spectrometer and so on. It turned out to be a Dabco, diazobicyclic, and sure enough, we had a consultant in those days. His name is Milton Orchin, and Milton Orchin said, "You know, there's a key reaction that's very necessary, and it's making polyurethanes, that you react toluene diisocyanate with some polyols, and it blows up in a little foam." And so we gave him a few grams of this mysterious substance, diazobicyclooctane, and he called up a week later, very excited, said, "We tried it in the lab and it works 10 times better than everything else." So serendipity, but the prepared capability to look around and to try new things turned out to be very successful, highly financially successful research project, and it turns out sort of satisfactory that the product we made in itself was a catalyst. That turns out very well too.
How would you compare research at Houdry during the war and immediately following it?
Right. Well, I think there were two related facets. One, during the war, there was a great feeling that we weren't soldiers on the front, but by gosh, we better do our part. And this was sparked by the people involved, all the way from the Pugh family, the owners of Sun Oil, to Houdry himself, and others, that we could work night and day, and that we could do. And if somebody had an experiment, they were out going to put it in a little unit, and surely in 6 months it ought to move from a research phase, first experiment, to production in 6 months. So there was the capability of doing things in a relatively short time that somehow seems to be lost, maybe because plants are so big. So that was one thing. The other aspect is that I think there was a period when, as I recall it, we were free to do a lot of exploratory things, and we found ourselves in loud shouting arguments with each other as to what the reason was, and if nothing else, it drove us to go back to the lab and to try the experiment ourselves, and so on. A related thing also is that the top management, Houdry, Bates, Peterkin, and others, they wanted to see the experiments. And the extreme that I remember was Houdry would get a kitchen chair and sit out on a Saturday morning in front of the panel board of a developmental unit and watch the recorders up and down through the cycles. And instead of at the baseball game, he was out there. Come on, get that product out, and so on. So that was part of it. And I think there's a serious feature there that the accountants, if they're head of a company, are not going to be as interested in the technical part as management, which are engineers and chemists and scientists of various kinds.
Who did you interact most closely with at Houdry during the war years in research areas?
Well, Houdry, of course, was there, and just afterwards, Oblad, really it was Houdry himself. Now, we also had a strong development group that was ultimately headed by Ted Burtis, who became chairman of the board of Sun Oil, by Jack Dart, very strong support activity by Jack Dart, but other people who then did the development and the engineering. And one of the things that was of our capability of the chemist to go to the engineer and say, I've got a little discovery, or I've got an idea, and could you use it? What would it do? And have the engineer say, well, I'll tell you what the good parts about it and the bad parts about it, and it would drive us back to then try to solve with the engineer. So there was a great cooperative relationship between the chemists and the development people, and ultimately the engineering group. We know each other, and we were the size of a company that could worked on a project together. I think that was an important part.
How did Houdry manage the company, or did he manage it when you first came to work there?
Yes. Well, there was a couple different periods. The first period, he was not so close to the company. He was out worrying about and became president of Free France, France Forever, the organization in America that tried to advise the U.S. government that they should be prepared for war, and so for a period of time he was politically involved in that, and incidentally he became an American citizen at the time. His two sons served in the U.S. Army, but then he turned to say the way that he could contribute was through the technical activity, and I should say that it's a criticism of his ability is that he would make the whole laboratory work on his ideas, and that had its good parts, but it also has deficits. So he was a leader rather than a manager. And so long as that you had a certain size team and objectives, why this turned out to be very, very effective, very effective. And after all, there in his lifetime there were three major things: catalytic cracking, butadiene from butane with chromalumina, and the catalyst for automobile converters to abatement. So three multi-billion-dollar things that he was responsible for the development phase, and saw ahead of time that there was going to be a need and these could be solved, and was a major developer of these three separate activities, catalytic activities.
And what was his reaction, or how did he act if someone didn't do exactly what he wanted them to do in research?
Well, he fired them. He fired them. But I don't know anybody that stayed fired for more than 15 minutes. So he came back again, and I must say I learned when you were in this conflict with the man who was the owner-director situation, if you would argue why you took that action, he would listen and had respect for that. He had respect for that, but his volatility was such that occasionally you were fired off the property. But then he realized, and nobody stayed fired really. I think the other part is really the enthusiasm that was something. Those were the negative times. On the positive times, how enthusiastic he could be, and you knew that that he would carry it forward. That he would see the pews. He would something would be done. So that particular project was not going to lie fallow. Something was going to be done. It was a risk-taking thing. He would get the money and get support for it one place or another.
Well, by the end of the war, had chemical research and the engineering company separated to any extent what became catalytic engineering?
Well, the catalytic construction company was really a phase of you had research and you had development and then you had engineering, and that all stayed within Hoodry. But then to carry out the actual construction of the plants, the catalytic construction curve was formed. So it did leave these vital elements of research and really two engineering groups. One was the development engineering who carried the projects further, and the second one was the people who didn't design the actual plants but really involved technical service, technical sales, and initial engineering economic evaluations.
Well, a few people at Hoodry were involved with going to Europe, or at least one was after the war. Were you involved there, or how did Hoodry get involved?
You're thinking of the German?
Yes.
Warren Farragher, I was not. Warren Farragher was one that spoke German, was very conscious of the people in Germany who'd been doing the synthetic fuels development, and Mintosh and some of the others were people that he knew. And so he went, and Val Hansel was another from OP with the people who went. And they traveled around, as we recall, of course, the Japanese people had not surrendered by this time. And so Farragher was one, Hansel another, who developed these detailed TOM reels that turned out to describe the various advances in both the two types of synthetic fuels from coal processes that were carried out during World War II.
Well, how did Oblat come to Hoodry?
Well, he came as a result of Chalmers Kirkbride. There was a recognition between the owners of Hoodry that Eugene Hoodry's interest was in these catalytic converters, and that was really not the business they thought of Mobil and of Sun. And so there was, by mutual consent, Hoodry left and formed the Oxy Catalyst Corporation, and so his interest was satisfied. And I must say, he regarded this largely as a humanitarian effort, that the world needed to be saved by that way, and that therefore, Hoodry having left, that there would be new management, and Mobil had a lot to do with now the selection, and they brought in Chalmers Kirkbride as laboratory director. He ultimately became president of the company. And he in turn brought in Jack Dart, director of development, Alex Oblad, director of research, and they brought in one or two other people, one of whom was Ted Burtis, actually. So this was kind of a turnaround from the time in catalysis where one person could manage almost every experiment to a more modern type of management with research director and a development director.
Well, how was the reaction within the lab when you went from more applied to a more scientific approach to catalysis?
Well, I think it was welcomed. I think it was welcomed, and I think there was a belief that, and as it turned out true, that there was a lot of petrochemicals and petrochemical process catalysts. Of course, one grew up in the platinum reforming and so on. So that I think that there was a capability to do things now. Some additional tools have been invented for catalyst characterization, and I think that I think this was a satisfactory arrangement for the individuals at the Hoodry Company, and I think recognition of the scientific and personal qualities of the people who then came to Hoodry. And Burt, you may remember that these people came from a division of, at one time, a division of Mobil. What was the name of that? In Texas, there was a division of
Magnolia.
Magnolia Field Research, and Kirkbride, Berta's, Dart, and Oblat had been part of that. There was a very strong team assembled, but it somehow got sort of disbanded. So that when Mobil really came in the driver's seat with selection, it was their choice to bring these people in. And that was the time when catalytic cracking got onto airlift, and so there was a renovation in that sense from the engineering viewpoint. At the same time, new catalysts were being developed, but we've spoken of reforming, of course, was coming in into being, and the concept that we had of recognizing specifically the dual site character, and that you could balance these and characterize these, the acidity on the one hand, the platinum catalyst on the other, and so that actually that turned out to be quite an important feature.
Well, now that paper followed reasonably close behind the announcement of platinum reforming. Were you working on platinum reforming before you opened?
We were really not with the platinum. We'd had a few experiments. But we were working on reforming. You remember that this was the era of molybdenum alumina. But I think what really helped us, and it was the concept, and Oblat was involved heavily, to say if we understand what pieces there are to provide functionality to these catalysts, then we can put these together in the way. So that's why I would say, not that we were contemporary with Ciapetta, who was doing a lot of work, as you recall, and Val Hansel, but that when we got involved with it, one of the first 5 catalysts we made turned out to be our commercial catalyst. So I thought that was a pretty successful capability to turn that out. And, even then, there are things that happen. Fortunately, the first catalyst load that Sun Oil put in the unit lasted a year. It was only supposed to last 6 months. It lasted a year. What is fortunate was that it was not the second load, because the second load lasted 3 days. And this was one of the things in those days we didn't understand all the details about. Don't reduce the catalyst when there's water vapor pressure. But this was something that was learned the hard way, and we advised them dry it thoroughly before we reduce it, but they were going to reduce and dry the same way. But so this was one of the little things that happened along the way, along with the fact that that catalyst, when it was delivered, platinum, is kind of in the jewelry business, and there was a question. What do you do? So the catalyst was loaded on the truck, and the driver was not told that he had $500,000 worth of platinum there. And along the way, he got a flat tire. He didn't phone anybody, and people were getting pretty nervous because this man was missing. This $500,000 worth of platinum was on his truck. So he showed up. He said, "Well, I just had a flat tire." Well, that's not a scientific thing, but you certainly remember a few things like that.
Did you get directly involved when this catalyst failed in 3 days?
Yes, oh yes. Well, obviously, there was a terrible furore with it. And the usual thing, the catalyst wasn't made right, you sent us to bed. You sent us to bed, but fortunately we had samples of catalyst, and we examined those and the catalyst as made, and so we began a whole series of tests as to what. Ted Cornelius was very involved with this, and finally could decide that there was a mobility. You know, when platinum chloride is reduced, it's a cataclysmic situation. You have great heat and change in an atomic scale. And if the conditions are such that there's some water vapor present, there's mobility, and so we were able to look at by crystal size and chemisorption, and we developed a cyclohexane test to show that yes, the crystals, that the activity was down, it was the platinum that was at fault, and the platinum had grown, and then why the platinum had grown. So we were able to deduce that, and certainly that didn't happen again.
Well, you mentioned cracking some time ago. How did Houdry miss the zeolite catalyst in the cracking field, or did they?
Well, the timing was such that early work by Berer in England really was to make these small poured materials for drying, and that there was the concept that these natural materials, the chabazite, it was limited to that sort of activity, and the molecules, the hydrocarbon molecules, couldn't get in and out. So it was just one of the things that we never got involved in that kind of synthetic chemistry that I guess people at carbide first had done. So there was 2 eras, one in which Berer had made some synthetic mordenites and some other things like that, chabazite, mordenite, and then people at carbide had made ASIV, and so here was the material not present in nature. And then of course it was Charlie Planck and Ed Brzezinski and Paul Weiss who were able to see that these catalysts could perform in a very unusual way, and emerged from that. We didn't do it.
Well, you worked with clays a long time. How did Houdry go away from clays to synthetic silica alumina?
Yeah. Well, there are 2 reasons. The prime problem with the clay is its iron content, which is frequently 1 or 2%. And so when clay catalysts age, they not only are a little more susceptible to temperature aging, but the iron comes to be activated, and so a used clay catalyst, if it's operating with a petroleum stock that contains sulfur, turns into a catalyst that is not nearly as selective because of the activity of the iron. So this was a great detriment, as one wanted to use not sweet stock but sulfur stock. So that was the main activity. But at the same time, and this especially in the war years, it was determined that the synthetic catalyst made a product that was about 2 octane numbers higher. And so the interest was in fighter airplanes, and obviously this was a great thing. So this was those combinations of making the synthetic catalyst. And also, by the way, from the other feature was there was the concept that we were certainly going to improve the silica alumina. You could put zirconia in it, you could put all these other things, and you were going to get a material that was better than silica alumina, even though ultimately silica alumina continued to be made now in synthetic, in zeolites, turned out to be still the basic cracking catalyst components.
Well, did you interact with Charlie Thomas when he was at Sun on his cracking catalyst, or did Sun stay independent of him?
Well, Sun was relatively independent. I would say that Charlie Thomas did most of his work on in the result in the paper at UOP. So if you look at the papers where he has a drawing of the 4-coordinated aluminum, that's the UOP paper. Then, however, when he came to Sun, we did interact, and we interacted in a fruitful way. Was that we could take, Houdry could, since Sun owned 1/3 or later 1/2 of Hoodry. We could take incipient processes and go to them, and they would be sympathetic and help us certainly complete the development and put in some of the initial phases, be the first company to test some of these. And of course, at some risk too, but then it was a great benefit to be able to go to the petroleum industry and say we've got an operating plant, Sun Oil or Mobil.
When Oblak came and catalysis became more science in the lab, the same people seemed to be working. It wasn't a total influx of new people.
Well, that's true, but on the other hand, Cornelius was there, and Molecular was there, and I was there. But just at that point, Heinemann was brought in, and Saul Weller was brought in, and some other people, Sterling Bolt and so on. So there was a change, even though some of the players that we've mentioned, myself included, was at Hoodry and were been part of this new, more scientific attitude towards catalysis.
How would you describe Saul Weller at that time?
Right. Well, he came with an excellent background, especially in synthetic fuels, but in catalysis, having worked with Storch at the Bureau of Mines, and so Saul had an excellent training. He really had an excellent training as background, and so he was able to then head the fundamental catalysis. We had, I just mentioned, we have 4 sections. I was director of research by that time under Oblad, Jack Dart, and we had 4 sections. One was catalyst research headed by Harry Milliken, Cornelius as part of that. The second was Burt Farkas, who headed the organic. The third was process research, which was headed by Heinz Heinemann, and the fourth was fundamental research. And I would say one of the things to recall is that it's unusual for an industrial company to name to have and support a section and call it, this is our fundamental research section, and they will be integrated with the rest, but to recognize that, support that. And so that was one of the things that made it success. And Saul, as I say, was in charge of that fundamental research section.
And as a person, how would you describe him?
Well, as you know, Saul, he's a very optimistic and pleasant person who relies on the force of his intellectual arguments to win you over, and yet is persistent that if he has a research approach that he'd like to follow, he'll keep telling you about it, and really a feature was that he and especially Sterling Volz worked on some semiconductors, the chromium semiconductors, and really pushed back the frontiers of that. Also, a little feature, he and a fellow named Ronald Dell discovered an alumina system that we ultimately incorporated into a number of catalysts that were successful. And Saul had the disappointment of not being able to publish on that. I was head of the publications committee and said, we can't give that away. And in the meantime, I didn't feel really badly about it because Saul had 20 papers or something like that on other things. But I guess the point that I'd like to bring out is that a number of the things that were discovered in the fundamental research had a real effect. Some of them in terms of thinking as to how to do these things, and others which are of key importance are in fact, and the one spectacular case was the case of this chromium, that when he had, the alumina, and when that turned out to be so effective, it turned out that we utilized that and is used today, as a matter of fact.
Well, how was it handled at Hoodry at that time that when people in science discover things, you have to suppress some of these?
Well, there was a formal publications request, and so it was written up and went to the Publications Committee, and the record will show that actually Houdry Company had many, many publications, more than chemical companies, more than petroleum companies, and the Houdry Company really responded to this because worldwide, they had a reputation. When you went to some country, they said, "Oh, we know you from your publications. We know you from scientific work." And of course, plants were selling, and there was a lot of support for this type of research and the publication. So we were very fortunate to be able to publish as much. So Bud Wheeler decided that I think DuPont was not that interested in the things that he was, that they were involved in the organic chemicals business, and he saw this activities, and Houdry Company had a good reputation, so we invited him to join Houdry, and of course got him involved in some of the homogeneous catalyst systems, which was sort of new to him, and turned out that he and I and Saul Weller got involved with trying to construct some homogeneous catalysts, sort of patterned on what solid catalysts would be. And in those days, not everybody thought homogeneous catalysts were catalysts. I must say Paul Evatt thought, no, and maybe Burwell too thought, it's heterogeneous, it's not really fitting in with the catalysis side. So we fought a little battle to tell them that this is part of catalysis too, and there's the way these ligands are organized. Doesn't matter whether they're organic ligands, and maybe in fact there's more opportunities in some of the organic ligands. So we did some couple of things with cobalt cyanide on the one hand, cuprous acetate and quinoline, and began looking at things. Of course, later on, Jack Halpern and so others carried this much further. So that was Bud Wheeler's initiation, and he worked for a number of years at Houdry, right?
Well, his science was unique, and I understand he was a reasonably unique person.
Yes. Well, as I said to other people, that on the personal basis about him, you never could get him to come in on time in the morning, but then he wouldn't leave on time either, right? So he was always, when he got interested in the problem, he just worked at it. But he didn't like to come in early in the morning, and that disturbed some of the administrative people at Houdry.
Well, what did he work on at Houdry?
Well,
homogeneous.
Homogeneous catalyst was one of the chief activities that he was doing, and he was also participate in some senses as a consultant with a number of other activities. But he worked with Saul Weller in the fundamental catalyst section, which was appropriate to his interest and certainly contributions.
Well, Oblat left Houdry. Was this a better offer, or? And then you took over.
Yeah. Well, I was director of research for several years before Oblat left. He was then co-manager of the laboratory, and he left, went with Kellogg, as you know, and then ultimately Harry Millikan and Heinz Heidemann went with that organization too.
And what did you find the biggest difference from being a research person to being a director of a laboratory? Or?
Yeah. Well, but I was director. I wasn't director. Oh. I was research director, but I was director for 5 or 6 years when Oblat was there. I mean, he moved up to associate director of the R&D division, and so that's where I was then below him. I had these 4 individuals that I mentioned before for several years when Oblat was there. But ultimately then, in 1968, I left and went with first the Bureau of Mines, and then Office of Coal Research, IRDA, DOE. These were sort of the same organizations. And I found that I was interacting with a lot of people that I had, the Wellers and the Heinemans and the Oblats. We had various projects with them. And as perhaps you know, one of the interesting things that turned out was this so-called methanol to gasoline process. And then came one day, Heinemann and Paul Weiss and Cy Meisel, and said, from Mobil, and said, we have a little invention here, but they tell us it's too long range. Can we work with you folks in what was then the Office of Coal Research and jointly do this? So we developed something and process with that. And I like to remind people that my division funded 70% and Mobil 30%. So this was a joint development division on their invention was developed, and as you know, it's been installed in New Zealand, makes a third of all their gasoline there, and has many ramifications in the use of ZSM-5 on Micro 7. We're hearing at the meeting that we're attending here, this Department of Energy meeting, we're hearing a lot of improvements and variations on microsieves and multi-component catalysts.
Since they have not closed the Houdry laboratory per se, what do you see led to the rapid increase and then the so-called downfall, if you will?
Well, first of all, the Houdry laboratory has closed. They moved from that, and that's been abandoned. The Linwood, Chester, Marcus has been abandoned. I think that Air Products finds that catalysis research is not the growth situation that they demand for their research activities. And therefore, catalysis is not stressed by Air Products. They're interested in different kind of activities, and that they find that it doesn't fit in with their corporate structure in a strong way. So they ultimately disbanded any strong research group on catalysis per se. They do have catalyst people, Jim Roth, for example, who's their science advisor, chief scientist. And so they have activities, but it's not of the same nature of catalysis being a focus of attention with the development of processes especially for license and manufacture of catalysts too. As we know also, of course, the whole synthetic fuels activity has changed somewhat. And I must say that I'm much more optimistic about the future of catalysis than seems to be the tone in America. I think that making specialty chemicals is fine, but they're just wonderful opportunities now that we've got these new skills and new tools that all the way from making energy chemicals to plastics to all sorts of things that are just an opportunity as we never did before. Some of the problems we've never solved the fuel cell problem, which is a catalyst problem. So fuel cells have an amazing capability to circumvent the thermodynamic limitations. We have multifunctional catalysts that I'm sure are going to contribute to our energy situation, so we're not in the years ahead dependent on foreign oil. We're making some things now. A methyl tertiary butyl ether is an example of a modern fuel chemical, which succeeds because of its octane enhancement, high performance chemical. I think there's all kinds of leads that supported by the Department of Energy, supported by other places, and various industrial companies. We have in San Diego an interesting symposium there, and I think that the experts in the forms of Jim Roth, Perry Fry, and Cusimano, and who's the fourth one? Keith McHenry, were able to say that in sort of a follow-up for the Pimentel report, which is rather general, that there are some wonderful opportunities, and we just need to be a little more ingenious about articulating these, presenting them not only to government but especially to companies.
Well, if you were to pick a catalysis 5-man all-star team from your lifetime, off of the top of your head, who would you pick?
Well, I think I'm not going to answer. First of all, I need 20 people to do this right. And I think that we had at Houdry 4 of the 5 top people. Right? But we see other people, like, the Frank Ciapetas and the Burwell, the Hansel, the Pines, and so on. I think the perhaps the right point to be made is that if you expand that to 25 or perhaps 100 people, you will encompass the individuals who really, now in retrospect, have made enormous contributions. And the time was right. In the 60s, for example, you have a variety of plastics and petrochemicals and petroleum refining, hydrocracking, reforming, dehydrogenation. All these things came into being with new catalysts, new processes. So we were fortunate in a time to find that. But I'm not going to pick 5. I think it takes a few more than that, because one was successful. And Roland Hansford is a person I haven't mentioned. He was a great contributor too.
Well, some people are not as enthusiastic as others about the impact of surface science in catalysis over the last 10 years. What is your view on this?
Well, I think a point to be made is that the surface science has contributed enormously and can contribute. I think what people have to recognize, though, is the warning that because these things are expensive to run, to operate, you must be much more selective in the experiments you carry out. So it is not that they're good or bad. The fact is they are good and they are excellent. But it does impose, because of the expense, that you do think out critically what experiments are to be run, so that we can begin to really carry the next step forward in designer catalysts. And I think that these are going to have these capabilities of doing computer-assisted graphics to do these. I just got back from Japan. I had an interesting discussion on artificial intelligence for designing of catalysts, that now in conjunction with the surface science. I think that, just to repeat, the view is that certain science can do a lot, but you must be selective in the experiments, and they're not. And I'll stay with, say, Bob Eichens, who will, and John Sinfeld, who will point out examples of people who had a real sense of what the catalyst did, and utilized thermodynamics, utilized kinetics, utilized chemisorption, utilized some X-ray data, and as Herman Pines does, look at the products distribution as a means of telling what the catalyst is doing. People like Irving Wender, who understands the mechanisms for these things, that these taken together with the surface chemistry, but I don't think we're going to solve it. The physicists, for example, are not going to solve catalysis, which is a chemical problem.
Well, now, as you look back on a few years of your career, is there something you would pick out as the most exasperating or frustrating has happened?
I think it's the failure of science, of the government and industry to continue research for energy purposes, synthetic fuels specifically. That we are in an era when people say there's no question that we're going to need synthetic fuels. We're in a disaster course, we heard it today from Jim Baxter, we're in a disaster course that we're going to, for balance of trade purposes, we're going to need these things, and this is exactly the period of time. And I think seen recently in Japan on the one hand, and in Germany, and Europe on the other hand, management and government, both in government and in industry, has continued to give support so that we really make advances. So anyway, I would say that's a frustration, that we're not more evenly supporting the research that leads to synthetic fuels, which I just know are going to be needed, and I'm not alone. Everybody else, I think, sees that's going to be a big thing.
And what scientific accomplishment do you consider your most satisfying?
Well, I would have to say personally it's the combination of a relatively scientific approach to catalysis and having that work in some of the cracking, reforming, dehydrogenation, and some of the plastics type of things. Being able to delineate functionality and put that. And this era when we were designing dual function catalysts, perhaps this would be the highlight of that.
And how does one working in industry feel when they've come up with a good scientific discovery, are unable to publish it, and then 10 years later see someone else publish it?
Well, I think that's life, and I thought you were really going to ask when they get a discovery and management says, oh, we're not going to proceed with that. Well, what you have to do then is go back again and think up some new good reasons, and hopefully do a little bootleg research to get some data that shows how good it is. So I think that the frustration is that if discoveries are not put to work, and the I think things really get published only in a few. My experience has been that they get very few scientific things ultimately don't get credited, and that, there's devices. First of all, they're put into a patent, and most companies, after the patent is either allowed or issued, are willing to have things published.
Having been in research for a long time in a company, do you have a feel for how much of discoveries, or what fraction of discoveries are a result of this bootleg research that people feel strongly on?
It's hard to put it's hard to put a percentage to it, but the other thing you can say, it's a very forceful thing, because there are several examples which you can point out in which there was a little incentive there, and I guess what it really speaks to is the importance of the personal conviction. And if somebody feels strongly enough they want to make it, they'll work very hard with great perception and skill to at least test it and see whether, give it a chance and see whether it can. So this is, I think, the part that the bootleg research is the research part, but it's all the other half of that is the determination to do a good experiment and get some results that can be utilized.
What do you feel is the most important quality in directing technical researchers?
Well, I thought about that one time when I had a little something to say with Alex Oblad, and I came to a word of style. It's the style of research that comes in, and style means the way you go about doing things. And I think it's the balance of leading, which is crucial, and yet providing freedom. And I think this is a part that I've seen work best when there was a strong leader who would say we're going to work along a certain line and see that this is a persuasive opportunity, and then allow people to do work and give them time, have them come back, describe what they do, and then in a detailed way I'll discuss it and decide what the new opportunities were. And so it then becomes a combination of cooperation on the one hand, but leadership style on the other. So
yeah,
that's it. Let me tell you one last thing. You got that on still? I'm going to tell you one last thing.
Go ahead.
Yeah, right. Not too long ago, I went and I saw one of the people I work with, and I said, I just counted up how many co-authors that I've had on scientific papers, and I found out that I have 53 people that I've published papers with. And I thought I was rather proud of that, but he said, gee, you must not be able to get along with anybody.